Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, over the previous 6 weeks, we examined several of the accounts in the suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya of the Buddha's quest for enlightenment and of his attainment of enlightenment. And after he attained enlightenment, he began to teach. He began with the 5 ascetics who had been his former attendants, and then gradually his teaching started to spread out over wider circles in northeast India. And after his enlightenment, he observed a regular annual routine for 8 or 9 months of the year, together with large numbers of monks and later nuns. He would wander over the highways and pathways of India, stopping at different towns, villages, hamlets, in order to teach the Dhamma to people. And then during the 4 months of the Indian rainy season, which extends from early July till early October, he, together with the monastic community, would settle in a fixed residence because it was difficult to travel during the time of the rains. And in this sutta, which we're going to study today, we encounter the Buddha in the course of his teaching career. And I chose this sutta as the beginning point for our discussion of the Buddha's teachings because I think it provides a very suitable entryway into the teaching. This sutta and the one we will take starting next week. They show what I would consider the proper approach to take in getting access to the teaching. It's not so wise to begin just explaining what are the fundamental doctrines of Buddhism, but the Buddha was a very skillful, methodical teacher who would always adjust his presentation of the teaching to the needs, capacities, dispositions of the people to be taught. And this sutta is one in which the Buddha lays down a kind of what I would call a gateway or entrance way into the Dhamma for those who are not yet quite ready to place complete confidence in him. And I find this particular sutta extremely relevant to our own situation today, because like people in ancient India, we're constantly bombarded by a whole diversity of religious and philosophical teachings, all of them claiming to be the ultimate truth, the absolute truth, the only valid truth. And if one just blindly places faith in one without questioning, then one doesn't really have a chance to stop, pause, and investigate whether that teaching is sound, whether it is true, or whether it is even beneficial to oneself. One allows one's judgment to be swayed by emotional preferences, by biases, or sometimes one allows oneself simply to be overawed by the power, the skill, the impressive manners of a particular preacher, spiritual teacher, or religious guide. I remember during the late 1960s, when I was that time, it was before I went to Asia to become a monk, and I was living in Los Angeles, and these were the days when Eastern or Asian spiritual teachers were starting to find out that the United States is a very profitable field to invest in. And in those days I was living in Los Angeles, and there were always announcements, news coming. This week, this great guru from India is arriving. He is the one who's bringing the divine message. A few weeks later, that one has fallen out of favor, and then there's another one who's arriving from India or from some other country. And then people are always praising their own gurus to the hilt, and then denigrating the teachings of others. And so many people, I was already a convinced Buddhist at that time, but many people that I met were very confused and utterly bewildered by the overwhelming diversity of teachings and by the sometimes extravagant claims that these so-called spiritual masters were making about themselves. And so I found it very useful when trying to help these people emerge from this kind of dogmatic rut into which they had fallen, to use the Kalama Sutta as a set of guidelines for them to follow. And also the Kalama Sutta is, in addition, it's also quite helpful in enabling us to overcome the opposite extreme. When one is constantly bombarded by this great diversity of spiritual teachings, some people, many people, grasp hold of one teaching to which they which they feel some connection, or to which they have some predilection, and then they claim this is the truth, and then they fall into this kind of hard dogmatic attitude, and then they become prone to condemn others, criticize others, and extol their own teaching, their own teacher as supreme. The opposite extreme from that is that when people are subjected to so many different teachings, then they just give up on all hope of finding any spiritual teaching to follow, and just become convinced that they're all a lot of frauds, they're all a lot of humbugs, and then they fall into the opposite extreme of skepticism or even cynicism. And so the Kalama Sutta, in this Kalama Sutta, the Buddha offers us several criteria that we can use to evaluate a spiritual teaching and see whether it is truly beneficial or actually harmful. And by using these criteria, then we can select a spiritual teaching, or at least some principles to use to order our lives, principles which will be beneficial to ourselves and to others. Now the Kalama Sutta is also, it's a very popular sutta in Buddhist circles and amongst Buddhists, the propagandists for Buddhism, and often it's held to be the sutta which shows that you can be a Buddhist and still believe anything that you want, because this sutta tells you that you shouldn't rely on any external authorities. So if that's the case, why rely on the Buddha? Just rely on oneself. And so some people, quite a number of people these days, devise all sorts of ideas in their own mind, and they think that because these ideas, in their view, are good and wholesome, therefore this must be authentic Buddha Dharma. And so they go about teaching these ideas as true Buddhism. This also is a wrong point of view which arises from a misinterpretation of this sutta. Okay, let us now look at the text itself. The sutta begins when the Buddha is wandering on tour together with a large company of monks, and he arrives at a town named Kesaputta. This town was inhabited by people who are called Kalamas. And then at this time, the Buddha had already acquired reputation The Buddha had already acquired a reputation as a very highly accomplished spiritual master. And so when the Buddha arrived at the town, then people began to talk about him, and they began to inform each other of what they had heard about this spiritual teacher, whom they refer to now by his personal name as the ascetic Gotama. And so they say that the ascetic Gotama, the Sakyan son, he was the son of the Sakyan clan, who went forth, who left the home life as a monk. He has gone forth from the Sakyan family, and he has arrived at Kesaputta. Now, a good report about that Master Gotama has been circulating thus. And in those days, there were no newspapers or news reports, but word would spread from one town to another town, largely through traders, wanderers, who would move from town to town. And so when a great spiritual teacher would appear on the scene, reports would circulate about that person. And so now there is a set of qualities that come down, ascribed to the Buddha in the sutta, in the suttas. Different qualities are ascribed to him, and as part of the process of simplification and preparing the suttas as edited texts, for all of these to be joined together in a set formula, a formula with 9 terms, which are the 9 standard epithets or designations for the Buddha. Okay, he is known as an arahant, that is one whose mind is completely liberated from all defilements. He is fully enlightened, one who has completely comprehended all the basic principles about the spiritual life. He is accomplished in true knowledge and good conduct, virtuous conduct. He is sublime, what this word actually means, one who has attained to the ultimate good. He is a knower of the world, the unsurpassed leader of persons to be tamed, the teacher of devas and humans, of gods and humans, the enlightened one, this is the word Buddha, and the blessed one. He makes known this world with its gods, the devas, with Mara. Mara is the evil one, the Buddha's counterpart of Satan. With Brahma, Brahma is one of the high-ranking divinities. And he makes known this generation, or this population of human beings, with its ascetics and Brahmins, with its lower devas, lower gods and humans, which he has realized through his own direct knowledge. He teaches a Dhamma, a doctrine that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the right meaning and expression. He reveals a holy life that is perfectly complete and purified. And so this is the report that the Kalamas have heard. Obviously, I would say that the compilers of the canon have put together this report from different terms that it must have been used and putting them together into one standard passage. Of course, this same description comes in the accounts when the Buddha arrives at other places along in the course of his tours. Okay, and so now they decide to visit the Buddha. When the Buddha would arrive at a town, he would usually reside on the outskirts of the town, generally in a woodland or in a grove. The monks would spread clothes, cloths, and they would stay there for the night, sometimes for several days, living in the outdoors, going for alms food into the town or village for their single meal of the day. And so now the Kalamas approach the Blessed One, and then there's a difference in the way they greet the Buddha. Some, these would be people who have already perhaps developed strong confidence in the Buddha. They come, or at least they know the proper etiquette when meeting a spiritual teacher, and so they come and they bow down to him as a way of paying homage to him, and then they sit down. Some come up and politely exchange greetings with him, and then sit down. Some do the routine Indian way of showing respect by saluting with the joined hands. And then there are some who must be the cynics, the skeptics, those who are maybe dubious about all of the reports about these so-called spiritual masters. They just keep silent and sit down, thinking, what does this fellow have to say? Okay, and after they take their seats, then they tell the Buddha about a particular problem that they've been facing. Okay, they say that there are some ascetics and Brahmins who come to Kesaputta. And according to the commentary, the town or village of Kesaputta was located at the edge of a forest. And so when groups of ascetics would come, some would be coming out from the forest, emerging after having entered the forest from the other end, traveling through the forest on the course of their wanderings. They would come and stop in Kesaputta, spend a few days there before traveling on. Other ascetics who would be moving in the opposite direction, who would be heading through the forest, would come and they would spend a few days in the town before entering the forest and traveling on. And so many ascetics and Brahmins would pass through this town as they were about to pass through the forest. And so some ascetics and Brahmins explain and elucidate their own doctrines, but then they disparage, debunk, revile, and vilify the doctrines of others. But then other ascetics and Brahmins come to Kesaputta, and they will knock down, disparage, debunk, revile, vilify the doctrines of the previous group that had passed through, and then they will praise their own doctrines. Say, if you want to gain heaven, you have to believe our doctrines. If you want to gain enlightenment, you have to follow our way of practice. And so now the Kalamas were completely confused because these teachers, these different teachers, would teach things which were quite contrary to each other. Each would be contradicting the claims and doctrines of the others. And so the Kalamas say, for us, there is perplexity and doubt as to which of these good ascetics speak the truth and which speak falsehood. Okay, now one might think that this would be a good opportunity for the Buddha. Now he's caught these poor townspeople in the state of doubt and confusion. So now, if he had a very powerful public relations team, he might just have prepared the way for his arrival. Then he could have moved in and said, don't pay any attention to those fellows. I'm the one who has the truth. You just follow my teaching, and you will be able to gain enlightenment. But the Buddha didn't proceed in that way. But he took up the last sentence of the Kalamas, in which they say that they have perplexity and doubt as to what is truth and what is falsehood. And he actually encouraged them in this perplexity and doubt. He said, and this is, I think, quite almost unique amongst the great religious teachers of the world, instead of condemning doubt and criticizing somebody for having doubt, he says, it is fitting for you to be perplexed. It is fitting for you to be in doubt, because doubt has arisen in you about a perplexing matter. Okay, so now the Buddha is actually saying here that when one is subjected to conflicting points of view, and doesn't have any standard for judging between them, for evaluating them, then doubt is quite an appropriate starting point for one's investigation. But the Buddha is not saying that therefore one should become attached to this doubt, settle down in it, and then take doubt as one's point of view and reject any possibility of arriving at valid, certain, liberative knowledge. But rather, doubt is useful as, you could say, a clearing device for getting rid of the wide diversity of conflicting views and for opening a path which will enable one to use one's intelligence, one's own intelligence, to make assessments of different views. But now the Buddha is going to throw the Kalamas back upon themselves, not proclaiming his own doctrine, not trying to convert them to the Buddha Dhamma, but to investigate together with the Kalamas to see if there's any core, call this a hard core, of spiritual principles that one can rely on no matter what beliefs one is told to adopt, no matter what doctrines might be presented to one. Okay, so first the Buddha tells the Kalamas what they do not have to rely on, what they can put aside, put in brackets, dispense with for the time being. And here he mentions 10 things, 10 what are usually taken to be sources of knowledge, or at least sources of belief, grounds of belief. First, he says, do not go by oral tradition. Yeah, I always like to write the Pali, even though one might not understand. Okay, the 10 grounds actually fall into three groups. The first consists of 4 items which are kinds of authority. You call these external authorities. One is oral tradition. This is anusava. This was particularly the basis of authority for the Brahmins. The Brahmins believed that the Vedas were sacred, revealed teachings, and so they passed down the Vedas orally from generation to generation. And so the Vedas were a kind of oral tradition upon which they relied as the basis for truth, for understanding the nature of the universe and of our place in the universe. Another ground of belief is lineage. This is parampara, which means param is other, from one to another. So here it's a lineage of teachers. So we get some belief, some doctrine. People say, this is valid, this is true. What is the reason? These are the special teachings of our lineage. And we have to adhere to the teachings of our lineage. We can't question them, can't doubt them. They are absolutely inviolable truths. The third is simply hearsay, or could even mean rumor, just what people say, what is general belief. So everybody says, for example, it's good to believe in God, and so you think, since everybody says this, then I must also believe it too, so I have to believe in God. Then there come a collection of scriptures, some set of scriptures. You say, this is a sacred book, this is a holy book, this is a divinely revealed book. You have to believe it's written on this verse, this page, so you have to believe it. Don't doubt it. If you doubt, you'll be condemned by the Almighty and sent to hell. So the Buddha is saying, don't go by any of these sources of authority. Then the The next four grounds are logical grounds. Actually, I don't really see very clear difference between the first three, but they're different terms in Pali. The first, takahetu, we could say, is logical reasoning, just using a kind of rationalistic deduction. This is the way systems of philosophy are generally created. Philosophers begin by thinking out what is the truth, what is reality, how do we arrive at true knowledge. Then using their thought, they build up a system, and then they become convinced that the system is absolute truth. They proclaim the perfection of their system, and then maybe they take disciples, and then they become very famous philosophers with many, many disciples, followers all over, say, in Europe, and the European philosophers. Hegel arises, and 10, 20 years later, almost all the prominent philosophers are Hegelians. Then somebody comes along and they see this beautiful structure of philosophy created by Hegel. Then they look closely and they see a few little premises, unquestioned premises underlying the system, and say, hey, what if we question these premises? Then the questioning takes place, and then this whole grand structure of thought starts crumbling to the ground until next generation, nobody is a Hegelian. Okay, so this is logical reasoning. The next is inferential reasoning. That is, you begin with certain observable facts, then you start drawing inferences from these facts. The third is called akara parivitako. It's a reflection on reasons. I can't see how it differs from the others. Then the next one is called acceptance of a view after pondering it. This is ditti nijana kanti. That is, you hear a certain view, you consider it, then you think, I like this view. Somehow the view pleases your mind. Maybe it makes you feel happy. Some preacher tries to comfort you and tells you, this is a very nice system of belief. If you accept this, then you will be reborn in heaven. And it's not so much that you're overawed by the sources of authority that he appeals to, but you just consider the doctrine, and maybe it has some appealing feature, and so you like that view, and you accept it. Nowadays, many people like the view that there's no life after death. This is the only life we live, because if we accept this, then we can enjoy ourselves as much as we can right here and now. No need for observing principles of moral restraint, no need for developing self-control, no need for having a sense of conscience and a self-control, but just do whatever you want, get as much pleasure as you want, as you can, and that has a lot of appeal because it appeals to people's lower natures. Okay, and then comes the seeming competence of a speaker. Speaker comes not like me, but one who's very gifted in oratory, a real orator, who can speak in flowery language, who has very impressive manner. He seems, maybe if he's a spiritual teacher, very self-controlled, or very magnetic, charismatic personality. And so one gets drawn to a doctrine, to a teaching, to a spiritual path by the personality of the speaker. And then the last one is regarding a particular ascetic, or is a religious teacher, as one's guru. The Pali word guru is actually the equivalent of Sanskrit guru. And so you think, my guru teaches this, so it must be true. I won't question or doubt what the guru teaches. Everything is the guru. Have to depend on the guru. Our guru said this. Guru says that. Guru contradicts what he said yesterday. Now he says something different. Doesn't matter. It comes from the guru. It must be true. guru behaves in that way, completely unscrupulous, but he says the fault is in my perception, so I have to do something to correct my perception. Okay, so the Buddha says, don't fall back and become attached to these sources of knowledge, but find out for yourself. And now the Buddha says, when you know for yourselves, these things are unwholesome, these things are blamable, these things are censored by the wise, these things, if undertaken and practiced, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. Okay, so here the Buddha gives us the first criterion for determining what are the things we should abandon, what are the things we should eliminate. And we'll see here the Buddha's technique or strategy in his teaching. Almost always when he presents the teaching, especially in ethical matters, he takes the subject matter has both a dark side and a bright side. And the Buddha begins by taking the dark side first and showing why and how that is to be eliminated. Then he will take the bright side and show why and how that is to be cultivated or developed. And so now he takes the things which are to be abandoned, and the criterion for abandoning them is that you know for yourselves these things are unwholesome and blamable, but then these things are censored by the wise. In a way, there's a little contradiction here, since here there's a very light appeal to some external authority. One has to consider who are the wise people and what are the things that they condemn, that they censor. And then one also has to consider the consequences of the action. What happens if one acts in these ways, if one puts these courses of behavior into practice? If they lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. Now, if you make a statement like this to people who lack a high moral sense or who lack a keen faculty of discrimination, you could be inviting disaster, I have to say. But it's said, according to reports in the commentary, that the Kalamas were reputed to be a people very intelligent and already with some keen moral sense, some strong commitment to good behavior. And so the Buddha felt confident in giving them this advice. But even then, the Buddha didn't simply leave them with this advice and then walk away. But now the Buddha is starting to guide them through the process of question and answer. He's going to guide them and direct them in the direction that he wants them to follow. And so the Buddha asks, what do you think, Kalamas, when greed, hatred, and delusion arise in a person, is it for his welfare or his harm? Now the Buddha has taken for examination 3 mental states, which in the Buddha's own system, in his own doctrinal framework, the framework of his own doctrine, are called the 3 unwholesome roots. These are the 3 akusala mula. These are greed, hatred, and delusion. And according to the Buddha's teaching, all unwholesome states of mind, that is, all states of mind which are morally blameworthy, which are unhealthy, self-destructive, all of those states of mind originate from these 3 underlying mental defilements. The most fundamental of the 3 is delusion or ignorance, which means not understanding things as they really are. And because we have this delusion or ignorance, when we are exposed to things which are pleasant, enjoyable, delightful, then we latch onto them, become attached to them, and seek to hold on to them, to acquire more of them, more and more pleasant experiences, or to build up accumulations of things we enjoy, things that give us pleasure and delight. But when we are exposed to disagreeable things, disagreeable experiences, disagreeable persons, there arises dislike, aversion, or at the extreme end, hatred. And so in this way, greed, hatred, and delusion are the three fundamental defilements. And from these three there will arise and branch out many secondary defilements. The Buddha's suttas mention some 16 secondary defilements, like jealousy, selfishness, anger, pride, arrogance, conceit, laziness, competitiveness, presumption, rivalry, negligence, and so on. And if you look, where are these different defiled states coming from? They come at the deepest level from greed, hatred, and then at the bottom of it all, delusion or ignorance. And so here the Buddha doesn't take the investigation very deeply, but he just considers how a person behaves under the influence of greed, hatred, and delusion. And so he says, a person who is greedy, hating, and deluded, overpowered by greed, hatred, and delusion, his thoughts controlled by them, will destroy life, take what is not given, engage in sexual misconduct, and tell lies. And he will also prompt others to do likewise. Will that conduce to his harm and suffering for a long time? And the Kalamas say yes. Actually, the word here is Bhante. It's translated Lord, as though they accept him as teacher. But the word Bhante could be just a respectful term for a spiritual teacher. At this point, the Kalamas are not yet the Buddha's disciples, but they would address probably any revered ascetic they would address as Bhante. And so the Kalamas, since they are thoughtful people, they see that greed, hatred, and delusion drive a person into unwholesome types of action, unwholesome types of behavior. And they see that this type of behavior will be harmful to, first of all, to other people. Most obviously, when one kills, steals, commits adultery, or speaks falsehood, it will be harming others. And they will also realize that this person will be harming himself, even if one discounts any idea of an afterlife. But in this life, the person will be creating blemishes in his own character, destroying the moral fiber of his own mind. And so they agree with what the Buddha has said. Then the Buddha questions them further. Are these things wholesome or unwholesome? They're unwholesome. Blamable or blameless? They're blameworthy. Are they censored or praised by the wise? And of course they are censored by the wise. And undertaken and practiced, do they lead to harm and suffering or not? Or how is it in this case? And the Kalamas say, if they're undertaken and practiced, then they lead to harm and suffering. And so now the Buddha has enabled them to see for themselves that any type of action motivated by greed, hatred, and delusion is unwholesome action. And so one should avoid the most obvious types of behavior motivated by greed, hatred, and delusion. That is killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and false speech. And these four principles of right behavior are, within the Buddha's teaching, the first 4 of the 5 precepts. The 5th precept is to abstain from taking intoxicants. Taking intoxicants is not so heavily evil in itself. It's not really a moral transgression in itself. So the Buddha doesn't speak of it here. But if a person uses intoxicants, then the intoxicants cloud the mind, they suppress the voice of conscience, and then over time that person will be ready to act in any way, without regard for his own conscience, without regard for the opinions of others. So now the Buddha has led the Kalamas to see what are the unwholesome things to be avoided, what kind of unwholesome behavior should be avoided. And since this behavior springs from greed, hatred, and delusion, he also enables the Kalamas to understand that the practice of the spiritual life has to revolve around some attempt to overcome, to restrain, and eventually to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion. And so the Buddha concludes, for this reason we said, do not go by oral tradition. That is, you don't have to rely on any external source of authority, on any type of abstract reasoning, any impressive gurus, but just examine for yourself and you can see the need to overcome, to eliminate these unwholesome states of mind, greed, hatred, and delusion, and to control one's behavior, to adopt certain principles of restraint, of moral restraint. Okay, then the Buddha repeats the same statement about not relying on oral tradition. Then he says, when you know for yourselves these things are wholesome, these things are blameless, these things are praised by the wise, these things, if undertaken and practiced, lead to welfare and happiness, then you should engage in them. Okay, now the Buddha comes to what's called the bright or positive side of the teaching, to show the things that one should practice, the things one should engage in. And so he continues the questioning in order to bring out what is wholesome. He says, what do you think, Kalamas, when non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion arise in a person, is it for his welfare or happiness? And they say for his welfare. And now the words here used seem to be negative words. Non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. But it doesn't mean that these are negative states. This is just a characteristic of the Indian way of speaking. Peculiar feature of the Indian mind is to indicate positive states as the negation of undesirable or negative states. And so we have here 3 qualities. Lobha is the opposite of greed. So positively it is everything which is counter, which is the opposite of greed, everything which is contrary to greed. It includes especially generosity, self-sacrifice, readiness to give to others, to help others, the wish to benefit others. And it also includes detachment, renunciation, simplicity of life, contentment with little, freedom from the grip of materialistic desires. Then what's called a dosa, non-hatred or non-aversion, is everything positive that's the opposite of hatred. It includes loving kindness, the wish for the well-being and happiness of others, compassion, the sense of identification with those in states of suffering, It includes patience when provoked by others, patience in difficult conditions, equanimity in the face of changing conditions of life, not being perturbed and upset when things go contrary to one's desires. And then the third wholesome root, amoha, is literally non-delusion, but positively it is wisdom, true knowledge, insight, understanding. And so then the Buddha questions the Kalamas, when non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion arise in a person, that is, when a person is generous, loving and compassionate, and wise with true insight, is it for that person's welfare or harm? And of course they say it's for his welfare. And then the Buddha continues to show the argument. He says, a person who is without greed, without hatred, without delusion, not overpowered by greed, hatred, and delusion, not controlled by them, will abstain from the destruction of life. He abstains from stealing, from taking what is not given, abstains from sexual misconduct, and from false speech. And also he will prompt others to do likewise. That is, this person is living not only for his own welfare, but for the welfare of others. He tries to encourage others to behave in virtuous ways. And will that conduce to his welfare and happiness for a long time? And the answer is yes. Again, even if one puts in brackets, lays aside the question of an afterlife, but if a person lives with a mind undisturbed by greed, hatred, and delusion, that person will be peaceful and happy under any conditions. If the person leads an ethical life, then he will be respected, admired by others. He will be confident in his interactions with others, and he will be quite a respected person in his community. And he will be able to contribute to the welfare of society, and he will be able, if he's a family person, to maintain a good, wholesome family. And so all of these results flow from right here and now. Visibly, they can be seen to flow from the mind which is without greed, hatred, and delusion. And so then the Buddha questions the Kalamas, are these things wholesome or unwholesome? They're wholesome. Are they blamable or blameless? They're blameless. Are they censored or praised by the wise? They're praised. Undertaken and practiced, do they lead to welfare and happiness or not? Or how is it in this case? And the Kalamas say, if they're undertaken and practiced, then they lead to welfare and happiness. And so it appears to us in this case. Then the Buddha concludes and says, it is for this reason, Kalamas, that we said, do not go upon oral tradition, and so on. I think I'll try to finish the sutta, even though it might mean going a few minutes over the deadline. Okay, now at this point, the Buddha has shown, we might call, he's established the validity of wholesome means, wholesome expressions, let me get the right expression, of wholesome conduct as a basis or foundation for the spiritual life. Because his discussion so far has focused on what types of conduct should be abandoned, what types of conduct should be practiced, should be undertaken. But now the Buddha is going to go a step further and show how a disciple can purify to some extent, to purify the mind and experience the benefits of mental development here and now, and confirm the validity of mental development as an important facet of the spiritual life. And so the Buddha takes the case of a disciple who is going to develop what are called the 4 infinities, or 4 divine abodes in this life. The 4 divine abodes are 4 meditative states, which involve the expansion, the extension, without any boundaries, without any limits, of the qualities of loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Each of these 4 qualities has a somewhat different flavor. Loving kindness, or metta, is the wish for the welfare and happiness of others. Compassion, karuna, is the wish that those afflicted by suffering be free from suffering. Altruistic joy is rejoicing in the happiness and well-being of others. And equanimity is, in relation to other beings, is not having favorites amongst beings, not regarding some with favor, not regarding others with disfavor, but having a balanced and equal outlook upon all beings. And so, in his meditative practice now, the disciple whose mind is devoid of covetousness, of greed, of ill will, of confusion, clearly comprehending and mindful, first he pervades 1/4 of the world with a mind of infinite loving kindness. Then the 2nd quarter, the 3rd, and the 4th, until he extends this loving kindness throughout the whole world, embracing all sentient beings without any enmity or ill will. Then he develops the same infinite, unbounded state of mind, using compassion, then altruistic joy, then equanimity as the meditation subject. And now the Buddha points out that when a noble disciple has made his mind free of enmity, of ill will, by this practice, when his mind has become undefiled and become purified, then he wins 4 assurances in this very life. And now the Buddha relates this to the question of whether there is a life after death or not. Because this seems to have been the problem that was disturbing the Kalamas, whether there is any existence after death. Within the Buddha's system, rebirth is taken as a fundamental doctrine. But the Buddha is not at this point trying to impose his own teaching upon the Kalamas, but just trying to show them that whether there is another life or not, this practice of developing boundless loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity is beneficial enough right here and now to use it as a foundation for one's spiritual development. So, after developing these 4 boundless states, the disciple reflects, if there is another world, and if it is true that good and bad karma, good and bad deeds, bring results in the future life, then it's possible, even likely, that with the breakup of the body after death, I will arise in a good state, even in the heavenly world. If somebody is observing wholesome action, and he has infinite love and compassion, but he doesn't want to believe in this particular version of God, doesn't want to believe this particular sacred scripture, doesn't want to believe this doctrine about some divine messenger? Is it conceivable that this person, and there is a life after death, is it conceivable that if there is an almighty, all-loving God, that God will condemn this person to hell, a person with infinite love and compassion? No. But it's almost certain that if there is such a God, He will bring this person to heaven. And so the person has that assurance. The second assurance is that even if there is no other life, no other world, no life beyond death, and if there's no principle that good and bad actions bring fruits in another life, still, right here and now, I live happily, free from enmity and ill will. One has the assurance that first, when one undertakes these practices, the mind becomes very radiant, bright, pure, and blissful. So it experiences great bliss and contentment right here and now. And one knows that one doesn't have any enmity towards anybody. One can be friendly towards everyone, ready to help everyone. A mind which is open and accepting of everyone. And so then the third assurance he has is that suppose evil comes to an evildoer. That is, suppose there is some life after death, and it's true that somebody who does evil will reap suffering and misery in some state after death. But he has the assurance, since I don't intend evil for anyone, then how can suffering afflict me? Since I'm not doing any evil deed, I'm not creating any evil karma, and so if there's a life after death, then it's impossible for that my behavior to lead me to some evil destination in the next life. And then the fourth assurance he has is that suppose that evil doesn't befall the evildoer. That is, suppose that there is only this life and no life after death. And so those who do evil, in a sense, you could say they get away with their evil deeds. But even though they get away with them in the next life, but they still have to suffer in this life. Because by doing evil, they create misery for themselves, misery for others. They're blamed and condemned by others, regarded as outcasts of society. But here he has the assurance that he sees himself purified in both respects. That is, he won't suffer in the future life because, according to this hypothesis, there is no future life. And he's not suffering in this life since he reaps all of the benefits of leading a moral life based on the development of infinite love and compassion. And so the Buddha then concludes that when the noble disciple has thus made his mind free of enmity, of ill will, uncorrupted and pure, he has won these four assurances in this very life. Then the Kalamas, they repeat the Buddha's saying, and then they applaud his teaching and say, "Excellent, excellent, Venerable Sir," and then they become his disciples. They go for refuge to him. Okay, this is the explanation of the Kalama Sutta. If there is any questions or any comments, please feel welcome to ask. Oh, okay. I pointed in the back. Yeah. Please.
In reference to the quarters.
The four quarters, yeah.
Yes. Is it the four quarters? Are they related to the other words there? Above, below, across?
Actually, the four quarters are. Maybe a better choice would be the four directions or four regions. East, what direction do we go? East, south, west, north. So those are the directions horizontally Then there are the vertical directions, upward, downward. Those are the 6 main directions. Sometimes intermediate directions are given, so we get 10 directions. Is that clear?
Well,
Yep.
in reading it, I came to the conclusion that, first of all, when we talk about dwelling, that in fact we were talking about meditative states.
Yeah.
And was trying to make some sense of the quarters.
Yeah.
And I tried to relate it to the words that they were using.
Yeah, okay, this is the way it's done, actually. Perhaps I should have...
Above meaning the heavens, below meaning,
the lower realms, maybe.
Lower realms.
Or even it could be...
Because there's no concept of round world, right? So down is lower realm.
Well, there will still be beings living on the earth,
But
under the ground.
That's the third one, across and beyond, across and everywhere. So what could be the fourth? I thought the fourth may have been inside, inner space.
No, the fourth is... Let's see.
But that's just what
Yeah.
I came to, not knowing.
Oh, I see. No.
Okay.
So what one does... I didn't want to elaborate on this practice just now. But when one is developing the loving kindness, after one arouses and strengthens the initial mind of loving kindness, then one sends that mind to the first eastern direction, so that one wishes that may all beings in the eastern direction be well and happy. May they all be well, happy and peaceful. Well, happy and peaceful. Then one goes to the east, the southern direction. May all beings in the south be well, happy and peaceful. Then one radiates to the western direction. May all in the west be well, happy and peaceful. Then to the north. May all in the north be well, happy and peaceful. Then radiates above, all beings living above the earth. It could include perhaps birds or insects, and as well as other beings, the beings in the heavenly worlds. And below could include also insects, other creatures living underground, as well as the beings in the lower worlds. And then after radiating in the different directions, then one brings all of the directions together. So one just simultaneously pervades the entire world with the mind of loving kindness, not differentiating the directions. Okay, you had a question here.
Yes, sir. I'm missing a critical juncture here.
Yeah.
In paragraph 3, the Buddha says, he gives 3 categories broadly that people shouldn't accept: tradition, logic, and guru worship.
Yeah.
But then in paragraphs 4 and 7, he gives a negative and positive for ways to approach what to believe. And the phrase that catches me is when you know for yourself. Well, how do we know for ourselves outside of the frames of reference of tradition, logic, and nature?
I think this can be something that one can ascertain for oneself just by examining first what is the effect of greed, hatred, and delusion on the quality of one's own mind. Okay, even without depending upon anything that comes from external authorities like scriptures or some lineage of teachers, without having to reason or draw inferences or depend upon what some impressive teacher says. One just looks at one's own mind and sees when the mind is governed by greed, is one really happy and content? But one sees that, to the contrary, one is driven into compulsive patterns of behavior, which are harmful to oneself and harmful to others. And then if one examines when the mind is gripped by hatred, by anger, is that hatred, does one have a peaceful and pleasant mind in that state, that condition? Or is it rather a mind which is oppressed burning, searing hot with that destructive force of anger and hatred. And when the mind is bewildered and confused, does one really feel content or satisfied? I think that is something that can become clear, independent of any external frame of reference.
But I guess that leads to a secondary question.
Yeah.
And this returns to something you said at the very beginning in your introduction. Is somebody who teaches without greed, hatred, and delusion then automatically teaching the Dhamma?
I would say that somebody who is technically somebody who has eradicated greed, hatred, and delusion is an arahant, the liberated being. And so what that person teaches will automatically be the Dhamma. But there are different ways of or different degrees of overcoming greed, hatred, and delusion. And so somebody like, even accomplished spiritual teachers in other systems can have reduced a great deal of their greed, hatred, and delusion. And so they can teach things which maybe don't correspond completely with the Buddha's teaching, but still one would say that they are wholesome teachings, beneficial teachings.
In the second category, the Buddha said that we cannot depend on logical reasoning.
Yeah.
But we have another way of Yoniso-manasikara.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything to do with this?
Yoniso-manasikara is a quite different term. Yoniso-manasikara.
Do we use logical reasoning in this? Because Yoniso means reason.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say Yoniso actually means more careful, close consideration. And Yoniso-manasikara would be used in a somewhat different context from this. What is meant here is a type of reasoning that will be used by philosophers who are out to establish particular systems of thought. Well, not only Greek, it could be Greek, French, Indian, Chinese. Yeah. German. Any type of attempt to establish a system of thought purely on the basis of logic, reasoning, inference. Yoniso-manasikara is more, I would call it, careful, close consideration of one's own experience, sort of putting one's own experience under the microscope and examining what is happening on different occasions of experience. Any further questions? How about our newcomers right in the back? Is this clear for? Do you get a copy of the? Okay, you take that home with you. Okay, if there's no further questions, then we will stop now. And then next week, we will take Sutta number 60, which is somewhat akin to the Kalama Sutta, but it is more detailed, and also it actually uses more diversified arguments. And don't be intimidated by some of the statements of the points of view against which the Buddha is arguing. I'm not going to have to explain them all in detail. Now, we have an announcement here from Dao Ming has informed me that he is able to make CDs of the first 6 talks that I gave on the suttas. These are mp3 CDs. So if anybody wants to get a CD, mp3 CD,